Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, I'm Jeff Dozier. I'm from UC Santa Barbara. I study snow. I'm interested in, I know, snow in Santa Barbara is a great place to think about snow and ice. Is that too loud? Okay. So what I'm interested in the study of snow is distributed hydrologic models. And for that reason, I'm led into remote sensing as a way of measuring the properties that I know. So, I can speak up. Is that okay? I'm still on. All right. So I thought I would clarify some issues in remote sensing to kind of give you a background in this. In this, I'm addressing what we call passive remote sensing, which means that we're using the radiation that's in the environment, either being reflected from the sun or being emitted by the Earth. Now, there's also an area of what we call active remote sensing, using either lasers or radars, where we're generating the energy ourselves. So the constraints that we are under are essentially driven by the Planck equation. So the top yellow line is the radiation from the sun at the sun, and then and notice that every object radiates, and hotter objects radiate more at all wavelengths, and the peak at which their radiation occurs is at a shorter wavelength. And then if you take the sun's radiation and you scale it because of the Earth-Sun distance, then we get the red line at the bottom, which is an approximate value of what we see for the sun at the top of the atmosphere. And then the blue line is a body that radiates at 288 degrees Kelvin, which would be the Earth's temperature. And so what that means is that we can really separate the radiation from the sun with that is being emitted from the Earth. And there's really only a very small region of crossover. So we often think then of the shortwave part of the spectrum, the solar, and the long wave part of the spectrum, which is the infrared radiation being emitted by the Earth. The other constraint we have is the atmosphere. If we're interested in the surface of the Earth, then we have to see through the atmosphere. So the left-hand diagram shows, again, the red, the solar radiation at the top of the atmosphere. It's got some wiggles in that curve because there is absorption of radiation in the solar atmosphere before it gets to the Earth. And then the blue line represents the radiation at a typical clear day at the surface of the Earth. You can see in the ultraviolet we have ozone that absorbs some of that. And then within the rest of the spectrum, it's mainly water vapor that's causing the absorption, or there's in this part of the spectrum, it's mainly atmospheric aerosols. In the case of the infrared, this is the same kind of image, except it's from a spectrometer flying in a spacecraft over the Sahara and looking down. And so where the brightness temperature of that signal is high, it means that we're in fact seeing through the atmosphere and measuring the radiation being emitted from the surface. And where that brightness temperature is low, it's where there's a lot of atmospheric absorption, and therefore we're measuring something that's being emitted from the top of the atmosphere. And again, here we see the major absorber is water vapor, CO2, ozone, and methane. Now, neither of these wavelengths can see through clouds. And so in the case of cloudy conditions, we only see the clouds, whether we're in the solar part of the spectrum or in the infrared part of the spectrum. So what we would be able to do in the infrared, for example, is we can measure sea surface temperature. This has been an application that's now gone on since the 1970s, and this is the Gulf Stream. And an interesting aspect of this is that these rings that develop off the Gulf Stream that have important biological effects were not discovered until we had satellite measurements of sea surface temperature. Okay, now when computer scientists talk to me about remote sensing, they always ask me, well, what's the resolution of the data that you're dealing with? And the response is that we are concerned about other things than just spatial resolution. That most people say, well, you know, can I see a license plate from space? So these are the various, the sort of envelope of constraints that we operate under. So the spatial, can't do that. So the spatial resolution is what we often think of, which sometimes we call it the instantaneous field of view or the ground sample distance. But the other aspect of that is the coverage. That is, how wide of a swath are you seeing as you're making these measurements. And this is an area where Moore's law doesn't help you. If you're going to look at fine spatial resolution, you need a big telescope. And if you're going to have a big telescope, then you need a big spacecraft and you need a big rocket. But the other considerations are things like the spectral resolution. You know, how finely are we dividing that spectrum of radiation that is being either reflected or emitted from the Earth? But the spectral coverage is also important. That is, detectors are very well developed in the visible part of the spectrum. We have these cheap digital cameras. They do a great image. But when you go beyond the visible, out beyond 1 micrometer or so, the detector technology gets pretty exotic and expensive, and normally you have to keep them cold at those temperatures. The radiometric resolution is really a question of how finely we can quantize the signal. That is, if there's a change in reflectance or a change in temperature, how small of a change can I see? If I have a 1-bit change in my signal, you know, what delta temperature does that in fact represent? And the dynamic range then is also important. Over what range of reflectances can I in fact make a measurement? And then this all ties with the temporal resolution. That is, how often can I see a place on the Earth's surface if I want to point and look, or if I want to see all of the Earth's surface, how frequently can I revisit it? Okay, so just some examples. This is a measurement of ocean chlorophyll, and it shows the bloom in the North Atlantic, and it shows the areas of high productivity that are associated with areas of upwelling, and it also shows that some parts of the mid-ocean, you know, in the middle of the subtropical gyres are deserts with very low productivity. The interesting thing about this is that in order to make this measurement, we have to use wavelengths that can see into the water. That is in the blue. And those are the same wavelengths where there's a lot of atmospheric scattering. It means that most of the signal that you see is the atmosphere. And so in making this estimate of chlorophyll, you end up subtracting 2 large numbers from one another. We are therefore not very interested in compression, because when you compress the signal, you're likely to lose some of the low-order bits, and in this case, the signal is in the low-order bits of a number that has a lot of bits turned on. And then just an illustration of the effect of the dynamic range. Okay, so on the left, you see something that you're probably familiar with. This is a Landsat image. This is Mono Lake on the east side of the Sierra. This is the San Joaquin drainage here. And this is a true color image. So, you know, I've mapped the blue band to the blue gun on the screen and so forth. Okay, what we see up on the upper right is I've taken the blue band, color-coded it, and stretched it. And what it shows, because the blue band has the ability to penetrate into the water, is we see things in Mono Lake. We can see sediment, we can see bathymetry, we can see areas where the lake is relatively clear. But the problem is, in order to do that, in order to design the band for this kind of work, you have to turn the gain up on it. So what this is the image of the blue band where I've turned on blue all of the pixels that are saturated in that band. So at this latitude in April, you're going to saturate at about a 30% reflectance surface. And snow, of course, is way above that. And so, this is not something that you can image process your way out of once you've saturated your band. Okay, so so how in these multispectral sensors, how have we made this choice between resolution and wavelength and other attributes? Well, this shows a bunch of the sensors that are available. So on the left-hand axis, this is the ground sample distance of the sensor in meters, going from a kilometer or so down to half a meter. And then on the horizontal axis is the wavelength of each of those bands in micrometers. And then each little blob shows the width of the band, and then the tick mark shows the center of the band. So in fact, some of them, the bands run together, for example, here and here. So in the case of the AVHRR sensor shown in blue, which has been sort of the workhorse meteorological satellite, you have 5 bands, a couple in the reflected part of the spectrum, and the rest out in the emitted part of the spectrum. In the case of QuickBird, which is the sort of highest resolution commercial satellite, you have 1 panchromatic band of 60 centimeters, and then you have 4 multispectral bands at about 2 meter resolution. Contrast that with MODIS, which has 36 bands going from 250 meter resolution to a kilometer and covering much of the spectrum. Okay, so one of the ways this all ties together is the data rate equation, which is, you multiply the swath, which you can design. The velocity, you're in a satellite, you're determined by your orbit. You can't slow the bird down to decrease your data rate. The number of bands and then the number of bits per band divided by the square of the spatial resolution. And if you do the swath and the velocity using kilometers and the spatial resolution in meters, then a square kilometer and a square meter gives you a factor of 1,000,000, so your result comes out in megabits per second. And so an example from, say, Landsat is you end up with about an 85 megabit per second data rate. Now, to get your average data rate, you would have to multiply that by your duty cycle. And so this is in the case of some of the sensors. So in Landsat, we have 2 sensors flying, although one of them is kind of limping. So it's a data rate, it's not twice 85 megabits per second, but it's about 1.5 times that. And then, but the average data rate for Landsat, which I got from just calculating it from the manifest for one of the recent years, is about 10 megabits per second. So you would, pardon? Well, it's turned on. Okay, so it's mostly a land satellite, so only 30% of the Earth is land. So you multiply that by 0.3, and then you would certainly multiply it by nothing greater than 0.5, because half the time it's on the dark side of the Earth. So you multiply it by about 0.3 again. So it's on about 30% of the time that it's over the land. And that gives you that sort of a factor of reduction. MODIS, on the other hand, with 2 sensors flying, it's on all the time. So its data rate, its peak data rate is just what it happens to be on the daylight side of the Earth, and then the average data rate is just the orbital average, because on the dark side of the Earth, they turn off some of they don't record some of the reflective bands. And then the AVHRR, which has been operating since the late 1970s, there are 3 of these flying right now. Each of them has a peak rate of about 2 megabits per second, and a slightly lower rate because part of the time it's on the dark side of the Earth. This one the AVHRR, you can build your own. This transmits its data down by direct broadcast to the Earth. So to get global coverage, they have to have receiving stations all over. But what it means is if you want coverage of your own area, of around, say, a 1,500 kilometer radius from home, for about $40,000, you can get your own antenna and put it on the roof of your building and get your data. These other satellites, the more modern ones, use a relay satellite for data transmission. And then finally, there's one of the ways of approaching this is you just want to cover the whole spectrum. And so this is an aircraft instrument. We don't actually have one of these flying in space right now. And so what it's doing is the top of the cube represents a 3-band image, and then the sides of the cube represent the reflectance going from through the solar spectrum. And these two black areas are those where the atmosphere is pretty opaque. That is, water vapor absorption is so strong. And that was your home in that picture. That's Ames. That's the home of Whirlwind was shown in that picture. Okay, now let's get to talking about snow specifically, because we now want to know something about the physics of the reflectance. So this is a graph of the spectral absorption of the water molecule. And the red is when the water molecule is in the vapor form. And so these are mainly the vibrational rotation bands, or vibrational bands, but with some rotational bands convolved on top of those. And what happens when the water changes to a liquid, the bands become broader and shift a little bit to the right. And then when you change it to ice, then the bands again become even broader and shift a little bit to the right. Now, and also notice that there's a huge amount of spectral variability. And this is the absorption through a 5 millimeter path length for each of the substances. So one of the consequences is that because of this, the spectral characteristics of ice, the reflectance of snow depends a whole lot in these wavelengths that are moderately absorptive on the grain size of the snow. Now, it doesn't change much in the visible, because those are the wavelengths where ice is pretty transparent. But in the near infrared, in these wavelengths in here, snow is one of the most variable substances in nature. The variation that we're seeing here is orders of magnitude greater than the change in deciduous vegetation from fall to autumn colors. That, compared to this variability in snow, all the rocks look about the same, all right? I tease my geologist friends with that. Okay, now, normally, and let me go back to this. Normally, the effect of liquid water is that it makes the grains cluster, and so they behave optically as larger grains. But when you refreeze it, then they don't break apart again. They're still large. And so one of the questions is, can you in fact see the liquid water itself? So we did an experiment. We were up in the mountains, and so we measured the reflectance of wet snow, and that's the red line here. And then we poured, over the little spot where we just measured the reflectance, we poured a liter of liquid nitrogen into it. And we froze all that water. But we didn't change the structure by doing it so quickly. So the grains were still the same size. And what we see is this rather slight change in the shift of the reflectance caused by this transition of this little bit of water in the snow to ice. Okay, and what we're able to do then with this Avarice instrument is separate those three phases of water. So here, there's too many buttons here for me, Dan. So on the left, we see the Avarice image. This is over Mount Rainier. Here is the precipitable water. that is the total column amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. It's least over the summit because the summit's 4,000 meters up into the atmosphere, and it gets greater as you go away from the summit. And we were able to verify this with some radiosonde measurements about 100 kilometers away. Here we see the liquid water absorption. That is, how far did those, when the photons went from the top of the atmosphere down to the surface and back up, how many millimeters of water did they pass through, liquid water? And what you see is there's liquid water both in the snow, but you also see it in the vegetation. And you can use this to actually measure the dryness of vegetation. And then we also did the ice phase, and then we combined it into a color composite. So the red stuff is dry snow, because the only thing you're seeing there is the ice phase of the absorption. The yellow stuff is wet snow, and then the blue is just the water vapor and the liquid water you're seeing, because there isn't any ice there. So we have this project to try to make these, what we call multi-resolution products, available to the community. It's a NASA-funded project. We're a year and a half into a 5-year grant. But the idea is that in the same way that a computer scientist doesn't want to become a domain scientist, but just understand enough of it to talk to the domain scientist, neither does a hydrologist want to become a remote sensing expert. They would just like to use information we can provide about snow, and then use that in a hydrologic model without, they want to understand kind of how I did it, but not to the detail of being able to do it themselves. So we've got this project, and so our partners, we have the Geological Survey, NASA, and the California Department of Water Resources for field data, and so we get data from them. The National Snow and Ice Data Center is also a data provider, and one of my co-investigators is there. And the intent of this project after the end of the 5 years is to transfer the technology to the NSIDC, and then they'll provide this product, through the end of time. Tom Barkley at Microsoft Research is part of us, and then we have investigators at Oregon State and UC Merced. So everybody showed logos, but nobody else has a ski area logo, because we also have we have a station at Mammoth Mountain where we take fairly detailed energy balance measurements. But the other point of this slide is to show what Jim Frew calls the data cycle, that this process of data to analysis to publication and dissemination, in fact, feeds back on itself, because of the idea that our presentation of the snow data then becomes something that a hydrologist can then put into a hydrologic model, and so the cycle repeats itself. And then if you can even say, well, then there's a policy decision that perhaps based on those hydrologic models. So the cycle kind of keeps going in that sense. All right, now the main, innovation in the product that we've developed is, because the hydrology is changing so quickly, we need pretty good temporal resolution. So we use the MODIS sensor because we can get it every day. But the problem is those land bands on MODIS are 500 meters. And what you have, anytime you have a pixel that large, or even as large as 30 meters, you seldom find a pixel where the whole thing is covered with the same surface cover. So every pixel has got snow in it, it's got soil in it, it's got vegetation in it. Some part of it is shaded. It may have open water in it. And so we call this the mixed pixel problem. And what we do is use the spectral information to unmix the pixel. And in that means what I can say is that we produce this product where for every pixel we estimate the fraction of that pixel that is snow covered. So if I'm running an energy balance model on that little grid cell, I don't want to be melting snow over the whole 500-meter grid cell when only half of it is in fact covered with snow. And the problem, if you use what we call a binary method instead, where you either classify the whole pixel as snow covered or not snow covered, then in the areas where there's, say, less than about half snow cover, you're going to miss it all. And then in other areas, you're going to overestimate it. And because the snow cover varies with elevation, that error is likely to be systematic. Right? So our daily data, we ingest the MODIS data from the DACs. If we look at two MODIS is flying on both the morning and the afternoon platform. So if we take the Sierra and we cover part of the San Joaquin too, that's something like 100 megabytes a day. If we were to do all the snow-covered land on the globe, it would be around 8 gigabytes a day. And so we reproject it, mosaic different passes together if we have to. Then we run the algorithm, and I'll show you the products that are produced, but that's about 20 megabytes a day. And if we did it for the globe, it would be something over a gigabyte a day. The processing that takes place for the Sierra is about 5 minutes on a 32-node cluster. And the difference between that and the globe is a factor of 60, so if you did it for the globe, it would be 5 hours on a 32-node cluster. But, that's something that Moore's law is going to help with, we presume. In the end, we put the data out, and we're looking at several ways. One is this Monster model, which is patterned after Napster. So you distribute the stuff all over the place, and you get backup in that sense. We're working with Tom on the TerraServer idea, and then at Santa Barbara is where the Alexandria Digital Library came out of, and so we're using that also. So the reason it takes 5 minutes of this cluster is that in order to do this, for every pixel, we have to solve this nonlinear equation. So we have the reflectance in some number of bands, and then we have an idea of what the reflectance of snow and all our other, what we call end members are in that band. And each of those is multiplied by some sort of a fractional coverage. And you can solve for that in the least square sense. The thing that makes it nonlinear is that we're also solving for the radius of the grain size and for the amount of impurities in the snowpack that affect its albedo. So now this algorithm is, one of the problems of putting something out on the web like this, and is that we're also refining the algorithm as we're going on. I had a professor when I was in graduate school who his opinion was that if you ran a computer program more than twice, it wasn't research after that. So one of the things we're having to look at is the topographic correction. And here there's a multi-resolution problem because, the MODIS pixel is 500 meters, but the topographic data are about 30 meters in resolution. And so what you can see here is, in this detail, is that in each MODIS pixel, there's a fair amount of topographic variability. And so we're trying to figure out how to incorporate that into the model. The other thing that happens is that we're measuring the snow that we can see. So if there's vegetation, we're measuring what is a projected snow area. And so we're working on how to do that vegetation correction. And we've got some field data that one of my former students has collected in order to help us with this. So the structure of the algorithm is the algorithm the kind of next generation algorithm is we use the land bands from MODIS. That's 112 bits with 7 bands. We use a cloud mask that's 48 bits. And most of you say, well, why do I need 48 bits to tell whether there's cloud or not? Well, the reason is that at one end of the scale, there's a cloud. And the other end of the scale, you know that there isn't. And then in between, there's a whole range of types of clouds that you might have. So we combine that with the topography. We run this algorithm. We need to get the calculation of the view angles and the solar zenith angles. Our main product is we get the fraction of snow and the reflectance of that snow. We have watershed information, so in fact we can mask a basin if that's what you want. And we also need this notebook idea, which is the processing legacy, because we may want to do it again with slightly different parameters. And then we put out these other products that kind of help us evaluate. That is the RMS error of the least square solution, the vegetation, soil, shade, and water fractions of the same pixel, and a quality flag. So that's partly where this 20 megabytes of output comes from, is we're not just producing the snow and its albedo, but we've got these ancillary products that go along with it, right? Okay, and then Jim Frew's part of the, Jim Frew has gone to where Tony would say is the fountainhead of knowledge for grid computing. That is, he's in the United Kingdom this year on sabbatical at the University of Edinburgh. So his idea of trying to keep track of the legacy is that we consider every model run as an experiment, which is this network of models that do all this stuff, and we use the notebook analogy that that Dennis and Patrick and John and the most recent speaker have mentioned. It's this persistent storage. If we look at the notebook analogy, it's, if you remember those notebooks, they were bound and you wrote in ink, right? And so everything we do, we in fact keep track of. If the result is garbage, we might discard the image at the end of it, but we don't discard what we did. And then this then becomes an execution environment. Now, the reason we need to do this is once we started processing a lot of data, we notice these are MODIS passes on successive days over the same drainage basin. The black is cloud cover. And depending upon not only the zenith angle at which the sensor was looking, but also the azimuth, is that we notice differences in the vegetated area between one day and the next, whereas in the higher elevations above the tree line, the answer we got from one day to the next stayed the same. That is, we weren't seeing a change in snow cover. So this is kind of what led us to the recognition that we need to adjust this algorithm in vegetated areas because of the view angle. And so that's why we need to keep track of all this in a notebook, because when we then do it again, we need to know what we've done, right? Okay, so why is this all useful? Well, so what we've done in the Margable Fork of the Kaweah, and this is a small drainage, this is about a 20 square kilometer drainage basin. And we, I work in snow, so I get a lot of skiers as graduate students. So we cross-country skied all over this basin, poking holes in it and measuring the depth of the snow, because that's the one thing that you still can't do from remote sensing yet. And then what we do is we run an energy balance model over that basin. It's based on the net radiation times we have an air temperature factor in there, and then we multiply each grid cell by the snow-covered area in that grid cell. And then we come back, we just run that for several weeks, that model, and then we come back, with our skis and our sleeping bags and stuff, and we do it again. So, this basin is like a pincushion. Okay, what we've got, so what we had during this period is we had 3 flights of this Avarice instrument. And so this is a model that has really good physics in it. It's got all the snow processes. But if we put in a nominal value for the albedo, the reflectance, what you see is, first of all, we get a lot of error, and this is the modeled minus the observed. And not only do we get a lot of error, but the error is systematic. It's not random error. And then if we do a little better, if we use an age decay function for the albedo, that is as the snow gets older, the albedo drops, and there's some experimental evidence from that. But the result that really gives us a pretty good a pretty good comparison between model and observation is we used the 3 aircraft flights to estimate the albedo for each pixel for each duration, and then we developed an aging function that was pixel specific, because that means the snow on the north-facing slopes is evolving differently than the slope on the south-facing slopes. And if we do that, not only do we get smaller error, but there doesn't appear to be much of a bias. So at least not only is the error smaller, but the differences are between positive and negative are distributed evenly, right? So, it's not a great surprise. When you have a model that has good physics in it, you also have to have good data that go along with that. Okay. So. I work on the avalanche problem a lot. The real difficulty with the avalanche stuff is that it's, okay, first of all, the knowledge about the bonding between snow crystals has been wrong for 40 years, and we've discovered that about 5 years ago. And so, but the other problem is that the avalanche starting zones are often really small. And it's really hard, and what's going on is deep in the snowpack. So you can do these energy balance calculations, and you can get some idea of where you might have avalanche danger, but you wouldn't want to base your forecast on that. Yeah?
I noticed that you have some sort of quality flags attached to one of your models. Are they data quality, model quality? What?
Well, in other words, we want to give, first of all, the input data have quality flags attached to them. For example, on one of the MODIS sensors, one of the bands is out. But the other is, you want to give people some estimate of how good you think the product is. And so one of the things we try to do is we'll try to run the model even if we have thin clouds. But we want to be a little more careful of the result if we're seeing it through cloud cover. Yeah? Okay, so there's currently no operational way to do that with remote sensing. You can do it with a multi-frequency radar, and we had a pretty good result from the Sur-C experiment, but that was one 10-day flight during the snow season. The way you can use this, though, is... No. The way, though, you can use these kinds of models is you can do... There is one thing I can tell, is when it goes to 0. And so one thing you can do is you can run the model backwards from that point and know how deep it was after the fact. The other thing we're looking at is whether there is a correlation between the texture of the snow cover, and that is the kind of fine scale variability, and the measurement. And so there are, in the same mountain range, you tend to have the same kind of patterns of accumulation that occur that are somewhat similar from one year to the next. So, but really what you need is a multi-frequency radar. And, those are expensive. So. Okay, thank you.